Hi, Rachel. I'm so glad you're here. I'm one of those houseplant growers that specializes in African violets and Christmas cacti. And so I decided this is the year I'm going to branch out. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say to us today. And a tip for those listening in, you might want to ask Rachel how many houseplants she has. And visit her at Jungle House. And I will turn it over to Rachel.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here and watching. I have to do a preemptive apology. I have two very feisty puppies, and I'm positive they will bark during this because they know when I'm on Zoom and they know that that's time to bark. So, or an early apology on behalf of my dogs. So I'm Rachel. I co-own Jungle House with my husband, Jamie. We've been open now for coming up on a little over 2 years. November was our 2-year anniversary. And I have a lot of houseplants. If anybody wants to ask, we can go into that at more length. I am self-taught, so big disclaimer at the beginning of this discussion. I did do Master Gardener training this year. I'm still in training, but I am self-taught, and so a lot of this is based off of my trial and error and what I've learned with some educational backup. So we'll go ahead and get started. Like Sharon said, I love doing this in Q&A form. I think it's the best way to address new issues and talk about things at length that might be plaguing some of you. So feel free to ask me if you have a plant that's bothering you or has issues. So let me get this share the screen thing up here. There's my dog barking. I don't know if you guys can hear that or not. Okay, so the goal of this course is to leave you feeling more empowered in your decision to bring home a plant and confident in your skills to successfully care for it. So in caring for our houseplants, I think that there's a few things that might help you be successful in that. Here's kind of the outline of what we're going to go over. Things to consider while you're shopping, the light in your household and the different directions that our windows face, watering, soil, fertilizer, pests, which is one of my favorite topics, accessories, propagation, and then we'll do a few pandemic hits, things that have been popular during the pandemic that we've been selling, and then we'll do our Q&A. So shopping, should I bring this new friend home, and what kind of care are you willing to provide? I love this meme over here to the right. It makes me laugh every time because it is my life. So what kind of plant parent are you? Do you think that you'd be an overwaterer or an underwaterer? Vast majority of people are overwaterers because we want to care for and love our new plant friends. How much work are you willing to put into your plant? There are some types of plants, I'll highlight one later, called Calatheas, that don't seem to love our Lawrence tap water and seem to do better with distilled water. If that's a deal breaker for you, you might want to stay away from those Calatheas. How much light do I have in my space? And then thinking about the environment in which the plant came from. Caveat, all of these are, everything that we carry is greenhouse grown. So it's not coming straight from the rainforest or the desert, but it could be coming from, a greenhouse in Arizona or Florida. And so we need to think about the conditions that that particular plant needs and try to recreate that in our space. As far as home life goes, what kind of life can you provide for your plants? A big one that we get asked about at Jungle House is if this plant is going to be toxic to my pet. The ASPCA has an awesome listing on their website of nearly all houseplants and outdoor plants as well, and their toxicity level to pets. 90% of the time it feels like they're usually toxic to cats, a little less toxic to dogs. There aren't many houseplants that will totally kill your pet, but there are some that could be very dangerous. So it's good to look up those plants through that. At Jungle House, we have little paw print stickers that we put on some of the pots for the pet safe plants so that it's easy for people to identify that it is safe. Do you travel often? If so, maybe you don't want to have a plant that needs a heavy water once a week, like ferns. They might be a little bit too much work for you. Aesthetic versus plant needs. This is something we deal with a lot at Jungle House, especially with kids who live in dorms. They really want this, to the right, this picture of this Instagrammy look where the plants are really full and lush and there's a lot of them, but perhaps they don't really have a window that can keep all these plants alive. Also winter versus summer capabilities. I live in an older house with older windows. A lot of my plants really don't love it up next to my windows in the wintertime, so I have to consider moving them back and perhaps using some supplemental lighting to keep them alive throughout the winter a little bit further back from our windows. Things to look for at the store. So the first thing off the bat I suggest is looking for pests. Usually a good sign of pests is if there's yellowing leaves in mass, so over 40% or 50% of the plant. Visible bugs, I'll show you some pictures of bugs later. Sticky residue, that's usually a sign that there's a pest issue going on. Overwatering, if that plant just falls right out of the pot because the roots are all rotted, that's usually a good sign that that's been overwatered. And we'll talk about how to deal with that later. Root bound, these two pictures up here, the one of this ponytail palm and the one of this monstera, are great and over-the-top examples of what a root bound plant looks like. The thing with being root bound is that that's really a problem that we can correct. So I don't suggest that as being a stop you from buying this plant. It's just something good to know. We'll talk about root bound plants later. And should I isolate and quarantine this plant when I get it home? My answer is always yes. I think it's a good idea to keep it away from your collection, especially if you have an extensive collection like I do. We don't want to risk spreading anything from plant to plant. So I usually keep mine in the bathroom for a few days until I feel like I've definitely given it a good inspection and I know there's nothing funky going on. So you've made it home with your plant. Now what? These are my things I always tell people: stay calm, don't freak out, and be patient. So people come in, they'll buy a plant from us or from another store. They'll come in a few days later and be like, it's lost a bunch of leaves, or a leaf is turning yellow, or a leaf is turning brown. And I just assure people this is totally normal. This plant's been living in very ideal environments at a nursery or at a greenhouse where usually the humidity is very high. We have a lot of attention focused on it. And now it's gone to your house. It's been outside in the cold. It's been in your car. It might have been in a bag. So we need to just be patient and let things acclimate. Some things that we can do to ease the acclimation is to bring it into your home and make sure you get it warm right away. If you're buying a plant in the winter time, do not leave it set out in your car. If you're bringing it home in the summertime, you don't want to let that set in your car in the heat. Even though plants like heat, our cars are exceptionally hot and exceptionally sunny and they can burn. So, you know, bringing things home, babying them for a few days before you want to put them into a spot where they'll live permanently is a good idea. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about, and so I'll break it down. This is, of course, big caveat to this. Every space is different. Every house is different with trees, the time of year with the leaves, how close your neighbor's house is. But this is kind of a general breakdown of light. I love this graph over here to the right that I found on the internet. I think they did a good job of breaking down kind of what the light looks like. I would also say this is like the #1 question that I get when I'm talking to people is, what does bright indirect light mean? So basically, a north-facing window is what I consider to be low to medium light, of course, depending on your tree situation. North-facing typically doesn't get any direct light throughout the day, so we call that low to medium. When you get into your south-facing window, however, that's typically the most ideal sun for houseplants. It usually gets some sort of sun all day. There's usually a good amount of bright, unfiltered light. And in fact, sometimes it can even be a little too intense for some certain types of plants, but south-facing is usually the most ideal. Again, at my house, I have trees outside of my south-facing windows, and in the summertime, it actually is probably more in the bright indirect to medium situation, but in the wintertime, when all of the leaves drop, I actually get direct light, and so some of my plants in the wintertime actually have to come back from those windows because it's a little bit too much. East and west, again, depends on the house and your location with trees and houses next door. East gets that intense morning light that usually isn't so strong that it's going to burn a plant, but I have some succulents and cacti living in my east-facing window that love it. On the flip side, the west side gets that very intense evening light that usually is pretty strong. So we can consider that more in the medium to bright indirect. East, I consider also either medium to bright indirect. North is usually low light, like we talked about earlier. So direct, bright indirect, medium, low, no natural light. Direct light, I like to break that down by thinking about setting on the beach. You're just out in the sun. Most of us will burn. Most of our plants will burn. Houseplants especially, this is getting a little off topic, and maybe we should talk about this in a little bit, but houseplants especially are acclimated to household lighting. So then in the summertime, when you go to take them outside, if you just throw them out, full sun, direct light, most of them will burn, and it could kill off all the foliage on the plant because they're not used to that much bright light. But that's direct. My cactus go outside in the summertime into eventually direct light, although I acclimate them slowly. No, not many people get direct light in their house, except for perhaps in the wintertime when the trees have lost their leaves. That could be the caveat to that. Most of us will get bright indirect light. So I think about that as sitting on the beach under an umbrella. It's very bright. The sun is still intense, but the rays are not directly hitting me, my skin, or the foliage of the plant. So bright and direct is what most of our south-facing windows will be. And again, like I said earlier, that's typically the most ideal light for houseplants, although they can survive in less. Medium, low, / no natural light. So medium is usually, there's some rays trickling in. See us in this medium spot right here. There's some rays trickling in, but there's no direct rays at all. And it's going to be pretty filtered by the time it gets to that area. Good medium light plants are like pothos or devil's ivy, some people call it. Some of those vining philodendrons, those do great in medium light. Low / no natural light. So low light, you can see back here on the far right of that graph, there's really no direct rays going at all. And it's extremely filtered. Some typical plants that are good with the low light are like Sansevieria or mother-in-law's tongue, ZZ plants, even some pothos and vining philodendrons can handle it all the way back there in low light. Now, the caveat to all of this, and we'll talk about watering in more length in a minute, is that the watering is going to change tremendously between low light to bright indirect to direct light. Typically, anything that's living in a low light or no natural lighting will need far less water than anything in direct or bright indirect light. So our Sansevieria, our mother-in-law's tongue, our ZZ plants, at Jungle House, we only water those things about every 3 to 4 weeks. They like to be bone dry. They're not actively growing usually in these settings. They're just surviving. And so they don't need much to keep them alive. Now, things that are in bright indirect or direct light will need water probably once a week because they're actively growing, the sun is drying out the soil, and they're going through their resources faster, so they need more. A quick tip about no natural light, no plant wants to live in no natural light. They don't want that. However, there are some things that you can put in no natural light that will survive under just fluorescent lights. It's not that that plant is happy or that that plant is thriving, but it will survive. So there are people that come in and want to buy a plant for their office, which doesn't have a window. Usually I go with the Sansevieria or the ZZ route. It will most likely survive, but it's not going to be an extremely happy or thriving plant. So it is possible. Let's hit on watering for a minute. So the distilled versus tap is an ongoing discussion that I'm having with a colleague that works at KU. They thought that I was full of it when I talked about a Calathea needing distilled water. And so we had a long at length discussion and found out that Lawrence tap water has this chemical in it that I always misuse the name, but I believe it's chloramine. And it's a type of chlorine that doesn't evaporate. And so even if you take that cup of water and you let it set out overnight to water your plants, that chlorine is not going to evaporate. And these plants called Calatheas really hate that chlorine, and it causes leaf burn. And I have tested this out for myself and at Jungle House. And both times I've used tap water on these plants, they've been unhappy. They're the only plants that I've found that really need that distilled / rainwater. Other plants would like it and they prefer it, but they don't need it. So that's been the only plant I found that really needs that purified water. Tap water in Lawrence otherwise has been fine for most all plants that we grow at the store and that I grow at my house. Let's talk first. I'm going to skip over the underwatering and overwatering. We'll come back. Let's talk about the finger test. The finger test is my favorite way to talk about watering houseplants. A lot of people will say, how do I know when to water this? And I tell them to check if the soil is dry. And then they look at me like I'm weird. And so the way to know that your soil is dry is by either using the finger test or testing the weight of your pot. So the finger test is where you insert your finger up to your second knuckle down into the soil to actually feel if the soil down lower is dry or wet. Usually if it feels cold, that is wet. If it feels room temperature or it doesn't feel damp, that is dry. I water all of my plants at home with either the finger test or testing the weight of my pot. And I think it's the best way to know when to water your plant. I feel like putting things on schedules does not work because of season change and foliage loss. If plants have less leaves or using less water. So I feel like schedules and apps don't work well. It works better to get to know your plant. The weight of the pot works by, I water my plant, I feel how heavy the pot is. In a week or so, I'll go check it again. If it still feels heavy, I wait. If it starts to feel pretty lightweight, I'll water it. That works great for me at home with the quantity of houseplants I have. I just go around and pick them up real fast, and I'm like, oh, it's time. Also, I've really gotten to know my plants. Then I can tell when that leaf is droopy or looking wrinkled, I know it's time for water. Whereas when it's watered and, in a fully watered state, that leaf is usually really plump and upright. So learning how to read your plant, that segues into the next piece here, I think is really helpful. So research how to listen to your plant. Calatheas, which is that plant we talked about earlier that likes distilled water, I can't really rely on it to communicate with me that it needs water, because by the point that it's looking droopy and sad, they're so sensitive, we'll start to lose some foliage. However, pothos or devil's ivy gets droopy and looks sad, and I wait for that plant to do that before I water it, and it's all good. It tells me it's time, let's do it. So kind of learning your plant's needs and how sensitive that plant is to watering or underwatering is smart. So let's get back up to the underwater versus overwater tab. In my opinion, all plants can really sustain and be okay if you tend to underwater your plants, whereas if you overwater, you're going down a slippery slope of rotting out the roots. So underwatering, in my opinion, whenever I speak to people about watering their plants, I almost always tell them the longest amount of time that plant can go without water, without dying, because I feel like it's much easier to bounce back from that if you overwater. We'll talk about how to deal with underwatering and overwatering in just a little bit, but usually when I speak to, let's say, an alocasia, and I'm like, you should water that every 10 to 14 days, I'm giving you the longest amount of time I think that plant can probably live without water. Whereas, it would be much happier actually if you probably watered it once a week. But once you overwater, it's really a slippery slope. The roots will start to rot out and you're doing more of a rehab project. Whereas if it's been underwatered, you can skip down to the bottom here and we can talk about bottom watering. So bottom watering, there's a picture of this down here in the bottom right. Also, that picture of the bathtub is what my house looks like about 90% of the time. My husband, it drives him crazy because he goes to take a shower and there's like 15 plants soaking in there because I bottom water a lot of my plants. So bottom watering is helpful when your plant has gotten so dry that the soil has actually become hydrophobic, and you go to water it and the water just rolls right off. Excuse me. So bottom watering is nice because you actually submerge that pot into a standing amount of water, and then the drainage hole at the bottom of that pot sucks the water up into the soil, and that soil gets fully saturated that way. Whereas if I just dump some water over the top and that soil is a little bit hydrophobic, it's not actually going to get watered. I bottom water, especially my cactus and succulents, because they go so long in between watering that soil gets just really compact and dry and it won't accept any water. I also bottom water because I tend to be fairly tired by the time I get home. And so I just fill up my bathtub with like 2 inches of water and set those suckers in there and let them soak it up. So it tends to be kind of a life hack for me by doing it that way. Bottom watering does not work if you are a consistent waterer and your soil kind of sustains moisture all the time. The soil won't be dry enough to actually suck that up. So it's got to be something that's gotten pretty dry for it to work. So I've gotten this plant home and this is not going well. Now what? So underwatering and overwatering are usually the first two places I start with people before we get into discussions about pests and repotting the plant. So if you overwatered, I typically suggest physically removing that plant from the soil. If the roots have started to rot out or become slimy, I suggest that you cut those parts away and then amend your potting soil with perlite. We'll talk about more soil amendments in a minute, but perlite's that white grainy stuff. Perlite absorbs a lot of moisture, so I love it for amending that potting soil and kind of sucking out some of the moisture. If the plant's been really overwatered, you may have to consider removing some of the foliage and trying to grow back the plant from just the bottom stem or a node or a cutting or something like that. But overwatering is a much messier deal to deal with than underwatering. So you might have to pull it out like we talked about, remove roots, amend that potting soil, perhaps even leave the plant out of this pot overnight and let it really dry out. That picture up there to the right, it looks like that plant has more going on with it than just overwatering, but this is usually what overwatering kind of starts to look like. You'll get a lot of yellow leaves. The plant just overall looks a little mushy and gross. So that's usually a good sign to me that this plant's been overwatered. Underwatering, however, you can usually pretty well fix that by either bottom watering the plant and letting that soil soak up, or by taking the plant out and putting fresh new soil in it and making sure that fresh new soil is moist and ready to go. This peace lily at the bottom, I'm sure some of you have seen this with your peace lily at home. You come home one day and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, I'm dying. It's so dramatic. And then you water it and it perks up. It's fine. Sometimes you might lose a little bit of foliage from an underwatering situation. The plant just can't sustain all that life on it, so you might have to cut some back. But in my opinion, this is a much easier deal to deal with than overwatering. Some other things that can go wrong when people get plants home is, like we talked about earlier, they've given it a little bit too much care and the plant's kind of just freaking out. It needs some time to calm down. Also, if there is a pest issue that you've brought home from the nursery, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Potting. So how do I know when to repot is the other question I get a lot. There's a hot debate in the plant world on when you should repot your plants after you first purchase them. My opinion is you can repot houseplants whenever, because most of the time houseplants, with the caveat of a few, don't go dormant in the wintertime, and so you're not really hurting anything by repotting it. My opinion is to go ahead and repot that plant when you buy it. Typically, plants that you're buying from the nursery have come from Florida, California, Arizona, and they're being grown in soil that is appropriate for those places to grow, meaning usually the soil dries out a lot faster there than it does here in Kansas. And so in my opinion, it's ideal to just go ahead and get it repotted into some good, nice potting soil that's going to drain properly or hold the proper amount of moisture in it in Kansas, than trying to cope with and deal with this incorrect potting soil that has come from the nursery. Then we usually suggest that you repot plants about once a year and perhaps every year after that, depending on how quickly that plant is growing. So soil loses its nutrients after a while, and unless you are actively fertilizing, the soil will run out of nutrients and it's not really serving that plant. Caveat, there's always somebody that's like, I've been growing my Christmas cactus in the same pot for 25 years and it's fine. And that's cool. You know, if it's working for you, don't mess with it. This is just kind of a general guideline that you know, we at Jungle House suggest, that I suggest for my plants. But if it's working for you, don't change it. Typically people are fertilizing and actively adding nutrients back into their soil in those kinds of cases. Checking the bottom of the pot for root growth, and if your plant is drying out exceptionally fast, is usually a sign that your plant has outgrown that pot. So if the roots are starting to stick out of the drainage hole, or it's looking crazy like that Monstera a few slides back where the roots are growing up around the bottom of the pot, that's usually a sign it's super root bound and it would benefit from a new pot. Also, if it's drying out really fast, let's say you watered your Monstera on Monday and by Wednesday it's bone dry again, that usually means that it's pre-root bound, there's not much soil left in that pot, so it could benefit from a bigger pot. When we talk about up potting or potting into a bigger size, we usually suggest that you only up pot 1 to 2 inches from the size that plant's in right now. So if I buy a 4-inch pothos from the store and I'm like, it looks pretty root bound, this looks exceptionally full for this pot, kind of like it's busting out of its jeans, let's go ahead and go up to a 6-inch pot to make sure it's got some room to grow and I don't have to deal with repotting this for a little while. You do not, however, want to repot a 4-inch plant into like an 8-inch pot or a 10-inch pot, because the roots only go so far down in that pot. And if you have a bunch of soil and empty space setting at the bottom of that pot, there's nothing sucking the water from that potting soil up into the roots. And that's what causes root rot. So it's almost like a water table underneath those roots. So you want to make sure you pot into something that the roots will fill up that pot nice and full. There is a little bit of a debate between terracotta pots and ceramic glazed pots. In my opinion, it's not really that big of a difference, but some plants tend to benefit from one or the other. Terracotta pots are not glazed, and so they suck moisture from the soil, whereas ceramic and glazed pots are covered and don't suck the moisture as much from the soil. So let's say, for instance, I'm growing a Calathea or a fern that likes a lot of moisture. If I pot that into a terracotta pot, it's not that it's going to die or necessarily even be unhappy, but that pot's going to suck so much moisture out of the water, I'm going to have to water that thing maybe every 1 or 2 days. Whereas if I pot that into a ceramic glazed pot, I might only have to water that once a week because it's not sucking the moisture out of there. I personally pot all of my plants into pots that I think are cute, and so I don't bother with it too much, except for my cacti or desert plants. I always pot into terracotta because I tend to be a little bit of an overcarer and overwaterer, and so it helps, kind of a backup that terracotta pot sucking some moisture out of there. So I personally prefer my arid plants to be in terracotta for sure. Everything else, I don't overthink it. I just put it in what I like. Drainage hole is also a hot debate in the plant world. Backing up to underwatering or overwatering your plant, I always suggest there being a drainage hole because it's much easier to water your plant thoroughly, let it drip dry, and then put it back to where you want it to live and know that that water's gone out of the pot. Whereas if you pot it into a pot without a drainage hole, and let's say you give it a little bit too much water, you're already in that overwatering territory, and it's really hard to correct that once you've gone down that path. So, you know, once you're a skilled pro and you feel like I've got this houseplant thing down, if you feel like throwing a plant in a pot without a drainage hole, I totally support your decision. I just think that you need to be more careful with your watering than you would if there's a drainage hole. At Jungle House, we sell all these adorable little pots that I love, but they don't come with drainage holes in them. And so we just drill a hole in it before the person takes that pot home, because I think it's a much easier situation to deal with a drainage hole. You can buy ceramic or masonry drill bits off the internet or at Cotton's Hardware and drill your own drainage holes. It's not as scary as it seems, and it'll really save your plant in the long run. There is some talk about putting in a drainage layer in a pot without a drainage hole. So people will throw rocks or perlite or something like that in the bottom of the pot to give it a drainage layer. I personally am not on board with that because I still think it's hard to monitor how much water you're putting in there. But if it works for you, keep going for it. You're not doing anything wrong. It's just a difference of opinion. So it's easier for me to deal with the drainage hole than it is with not. So let's talk about all the soil and amendments real quick. I'm going to take a sip of water, just a quick sec. So when you buy potting mix commercially, typically there is like an all-purpose mix or a cactus mix. The all-purpose mix is usually a blend of like peat moss and other organic matter, usually with a little bit of perlite in it. Perlite's that lava rock that we talked about earlier that helps with drainage. In my opinion, almost all commercially bought potting mix, especially in the all-purpose realm, does not have enough drainage in it to successfully keep many houseplants alive without really monitoring your water carefully. And backing up to, again, suggesting people might underwater their plants a little bit more than overwater, I prefer to amend all potting soil. So these are our amendments that we use at Jungle House that are available commercially anywhere. Perlite, the white grainy stuff, is great for drainage, like we talked about. It's also really great to keep your soil from becoming too compact. It adds a little bit of air into the soil. It is an organic product, even though it feels like styrofoam. It's made out of a lava rock. Peat moss, like we talked about earlier, that's usually mixed into your potting mix already. Some people use straight peat moss or an additional peat moss amendment to plants that like a more peaty or moisture retentive soil. So sometimes I've used it in like epiphytes, like ferns. I've used it in that and they seem to like that. The Lecka balls, which are right here, are actually a hydroponic growing medium. So you can use those in these little baskets to grow plants, especially propagations down in there. I use them more as a decorative topper. We'll talk about decorative toppers in a little bit, but it just is a top layer on top of your soil. It also, if you're choosing to do a drainage layer at the bottom of your pot, it also can serve as a good drainage layer. Orchid bark down there in the corner is exactly what it sounds like. It's a bark. You grow orchids in this. You can also add it to potting mediums to add more air into the soil. So I usually mix this in with like fiddly figs, alocasias, things like that, so that the soil is a little bit chunkier. Then I have more control over how much water is retaining in that soil. Horticultural charcoal is usually used in terrarium making. So it actually helps some with the moisture barrier in the bottom of a terrarium. I'm not a terrarium expert, but I know that this is used on the bottom layer a lot. Also, we mix this into potting mixes that are good for particular types of plants. Like there's a family of plant called aeroids, and they seem to like this horticultural charcoal, bark, and perlite mixed in together. It can also help with some water purification, although I don't know all the science of that. I don't want to go into that too much, but I know it can help filter the water. Turfus on the far right is my very favorite potting amendment ever. I use it in all of my plants. I use it as a decorative topper, but I also use this when we make our cactus soil at Jungle House. We'll go into cactus soil in a second, but I use it a lot. I love turfus. And then down in the bottom right is sphagnum moss. We usually have that mixed in with orchid bark for orchids. You can also mix it in with things that want a little more water retentive soil mixture. Like I usually put that in with carnivorous plants, also peat moss in with carnivorous plants, and they seem to like that a little bit more. Cactus soil. So at Jungle House, our all-purpose mix, and what the mix is at most hardware stores that you buy, is potting mix, usually peat moss and something else, mixed with perlite. The cactus soil that we make at Jungle House, and that I think is probably pretty similar to a lot of commercially bought mixes, at Jungle House we use all-purpose potting mix, perlite, and turfus, pretty much even parts of all three, and it makes a really nice gritty draining, well-draining mix for arid plants. So all my cactus succulents are potted in that, and I love it. It drains fast, it doesn't retain a lot of water, and I just think it works great. So I really like to get in and mix up my soils a lot. If I'm going to do a very large potting project and buying the pre-amended soil is too price constrictive, I'll just go buy a big bag of perlite, a big bag of all-purpose mix, and mix it myself in a big Tupperware or snap lock container, then have it there already mixed up for me to use, and I love that. One more note about potting soil is that it's wise to buy potting soil someplace for houseplants. Let's say this is all for houseplants. It's wise to buy it someplace that keeps it inside. When potting soil is setting outside in the rain, it gets really, really wet, and then sometimes there's these bugs we'll talk about in a little bit called fungus gnats that like and prefer to lay larvae in really damp soil. And so when I've bought potting soil at places that store it outside in the rain, I've brought home horrible fungus gnats. And so I think it's wise to buy the soil someplace that keeps it dry and inside. And another note on that is I never recommend using any sort of garden soil for your houseplants. I feel like it carries a very immense amount of bugs, especially those gnats, and it's not usually amended at all. And so it's really chunky and thick and not wise for it to be used for houseplants, in my opinion. Fertilizer. So this is also a debate in the plant world. This is my suggestion with fertilizer. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the right way for everyone to do it, but this is what works for me. I only fertilize during the growing season, which in Kansas is April, May to August, September. I personally feel that my plants, when they're indoors, in lower light settings, they aren't growing as much in the wintertime because we don't have as many daylight hours, and I do not supplement all of my plants with grow lights. So I just lay off the fertilizer in the wintertime and just kind of let them chill out, and then I go back to fertilizing in the spring, summertime. And I also personally move all of my house plants outside in the summertime because I feel the growth they get in the summertime is really worth it. You want to use higher nitrogen fertilizer for your fruiting and blooming plants. So my husband grows a lot of citrus, and so he uses a higher nitrogen Fox Farm fertilizer that he loves. There's a lot of commercially available ones that you can use. So I really like using something with that higher nitrogen to get those blooms to come on. And you always want to follow the manufacturer's directions carefully. So a lot of them will tell you how much and when to apply. It seems like a lot of them are very different in their length of application. So you just want to make sure to read that pamphlet really carefully. Some houseplant growing accessories that I use some of these. I think, in my opinion, a lot of these are more helpful for people who are new to growing houseplants than people who are maybe a little bit more experienced. But these are things that are available that I think are great when you're learning a plant, or if you get a plant and it's extremely confusing and you're not sure what's going on. A grow light. So I have grow lights set up in 2 places in my house. I have a certain room that I just really wanted some plants to live in there, but the lighting is not ideal. So I put up a grow light. Plants under grow lights, they need to be usually within a foot or a foot and a half of that grow light. So you can't just plug it into your overhead light and then say my plants have grow lights. It has to be pretty close. I usually use like a floor lamp and point it at that particular plant that needs it. You usually want to run that 12 to 16 hours a day like you would have natural sunlight outside. You do want to have a light in the dark period, so you don't want to just leave it on all the time. You want to let that plant rest at nighttime. Humidifiers. I do subscribe to using humidifiers in my house, although I use it pretty gently. I'm not making my house a greenhouse. I do think it just helps with the winter transition with having our heat on and the air being dry. It usually can keep some of the foliage a little bit happier, a little bit longer, and we experience a little less leaf burn on the edges in the wintertime when the air is really dry. But I don't think that it's 100% necessary, especially if you're growing pretty easygoing houseplants. I do also keep some of my needier plants in the bathroom. So I keep some of my Calatheas and my ferns in my bathroom. I'm lucky and I have a nice window in there. So that kind of acts as a humidifier as well. Misters. So this is another super hot topic, and I'm not taking sides on misting your houseplants, but some people believe that by misting your plants, you're supplementing the humidity. My opinion is if you like to mist your plants and it makes you happy, then do it. The science does not support that misting your plant is actually raising humidity significantly. But I don't, it's not hurt anything. If it makes you feel good, you should do it. Moisture meters. So the moisture meters are that picture you see on the right. You stick this long metal prong down in the soil and it tells you if it's wet or dry. People that grow fiddle-leaf figs or Ficus lyrata tend to really like moisture meters because that is a plant that does not like too much water and it does not like not enough water. So it kind of likes it right in that middle moist area. My mom grows a ton of fiddle-leaf figs and she swears by the moisture meter for that. I personally don't use one because I water based on the weight of my plants, but I think if you have a plant that's confusing or you can't quite figure out what it needs with water, a moisture meter is an awesome invention for that. An overhead fan. So I also, with running humidifier, I also suggest usually running a fan. You want that humidity to be evenly spread out in the room instead of just falling all on one plant or all down on the floor. Also, if you get too much humidity, your plant can grow a mold on top of the soil. So you want to keep that air moving while you've got the humidifier on. And then a hygrometer, which is a reading of the moisture in the air. They sell little handheld hygrometers, or usually there's magnetic ones that'll tell you like it's 58% humidity in this room. We run one at Jungle House a lot, and it's funny because it'll be like sad face if it's under 50% humidity, and then a happy face when it's over 50% humidity on the little hygrometer. So I love those. Usually if you run a humidifier, we recommend keeping your house somewhere between 40 to 50% humidity. When you get anywhere above that, you're getting condensation on the walls and perhaps causing damage to your house. So we want to monitor that if you're running a humidifier. Propagation. So this is a class in itself, but I'll just give you a quick rundown of kind of the general easy ways to propagate your plant. So propagation is making more plants from the parent stock. Pothos, this plant over here on the left, or a vining philodendron, is usually what most people are easily recognize for propagating their plant. Their grandma would have glasses of water lined up on the windowsills with the cuttings. I have glasses of water on my windowsill lined up with cuttings of these. So if you're doing a node cutting, that picture shows you where the node is, that little brown bump. You want to cut just above or below, however you word that, so that this node is what goes into water. And that's where your new roots will come from. If this foliage piece is in the way, I usually just recommend cutting that off so you have plenty of room for this to set down in water. Water propagation can take 4, 6, 8 weeks or longer. You just want to change that water out once a week or whenever it looks murky. I would say this water over here is starting to look a little murky, so you might want to change that out so there's plenty of good, clean water in there. I think it's also ideal to keep it in a windowsill or someplace where there's a lot of light. There's also stem separation, so you just pull multiple plants apart from the same pot. So like Sansevieria or mother-in-law's tongue, they're usually connected by like a big tuber. If you just pull the plant out of the soil, you'll find where to cut right in the middle, then cut it and then pull it apart. It's fairly easy to do, and you make more plants. There's also babies that you can propagate. There's a plant called Pilea peperomioides, or it's also called friendship plant or Chinese money plant. It's got these little UFO-shaped leaves. They grow little tiny babies in the bottom of the soil, and once they're about 2-3 inches tall, you can just physically remove them from the soil and pot them into a new pot. If you take a propagation like a stem separation, or you've propagated a baby and it already has roots, you can just go ahead and pop that over in some soil and get it going. You just need to keep the soil fairly consistently moist while it's getting established. You just give the plant a gentle tug, and if it pops out, then it's too soon, it hasn't rooted. If it pulls back a little bit, then it's usually gotten some roots and you're good to go. However, with your water propagation, I usually suggest waiting until the roots are 2 or 3 inches long before you pot them over into soil. What happens with water propagations is that when that plant is in water, it grows water roots. Then when you move that water plant over to soil, it has to grow some soil roots as well. But I do think that water propagation is easier because you can physically see when there's roots on it. Whereas when you do soil propagation, you have to just be patient and not mess with it too much. I water propagate most every plant that I have, and I just think it's so much fun to watch it happen. There's usually like a 50-50 shot when you go to move that thing from water to soil if it'll make it. So just be aware if there's something that's really special to you, you might want to consider doing it differently or just being really patient. So here's a quick note on pests. I've learned so much from my Master Gardener's training this year on this, and so I've referenced a lot of the K-State and other universities' information on it. The way that people treat these is different by opinion of what's worked for you. I tried to keep this all science-based and based off what the universities recommend. The mealybugs are what we probably deal with the most at Jungle House, and what people have pop up on their plants at home and that bring in and want me to help them diagnose it. Usually you can tell it's mealybugs because there's a sticky residue and these white cottony puffs on the stems of the plant. These really gross me out. I hate looking at these pictures. So the University of California Agricultural Department suggests a 70% or less solution of rubbing alcohol on a cotton swab and wipe away the bugs from the plant. Then repeat weekly until the infestation is gone. This can take a really long time to deal with. I have successfully conquered mealybugs at my house. I'm very proud of myself, but I had to be very patient and persistent on getting them off. I've used a combination of the alcohol solution and also a blast of just high stream water in my shower, and that's worked pretty well. If your infestation is really bad on any of these pests, you can attempt to prune away the part of the plant where they're most isolated to, and that can really help speed along your treatment of them. Spider mites is probably the second most common plant pest that I deal with. It's usually noted by those fine webs between the leaves and stems, and the leaves will kind of slowly yellow on the foliage of the plant. So usually the yellow seems to start from like that outer edge and work its way in, because the spider mites are physically sucking the nutrients out of the foliage of the leaf. So Raymond Cloyd said to try to dislodge the mites using a forceful spray of water, apply insecticidal soap or horticultural oil thoroughly on the foliage. Seems like they especially tend to live on the bottoms of the leaves, which is why they're tricky to treat, because you can easily miss that when you're investigating your plant. And then you have to repeat applications, and persistence is key. I've also recently learned that spider mites can travel through the air and on your clothes pretty easily. So you want to go ahead and check, and maybe perhaps even do a blast of water on any of the plants that were around the spider mite infested plant. So I get spider mites every single winter in my house. I've tried treating it many different ways, but usually that spray of water will really help me tackle them, and then following up with insecticidal soap or horticultural oil spray after that. Also, pruning away any of the really poorly or badly infected foliage can really help speed that up. Aphids, I haven't dealt with personally as much, but I have seen them on some of my houseplants. There's usually a sticky residue, clumps of black or orange round-bodied bugs on the undersides of those stems and leaves. K-State suggests treating them with that strong stream of water first, then follow up with your soap or horticultural oil after that. Also, I've just really done heavy pruning on a couple of my plants that have had aphids, particularly some of the citrus has had them. That it seems like the prune and the strong stream of water has taken care of them. Thrips and scale, we'll just talk about in the same slide. This is thrips over there on the right. Thrips kind of look like long, skinny ants. And they're usually like long bodied, and the leaves will start to yellow as the thrips get down on them. I've really experienced thrips on alocasias at the store. I'm not sure why they seem to be so isolated to that plant, but I've really experienced it there. And then scale, which I don't have a picture of, looks like little round, hard-bodied bugs it's usually on the stems of the plants. They suck the nutrients out, and so there's almost always a sticky residue with scale, so you know that's a scale infestation when you get that. For both of them, they suggest treating with systemic insecticide. Systemic insecticide is where you sprinkle that into the soil of the plant, and the plant takes that up, and then the scale will suck on the plant and it kills them. So also with scale, we usually recommend picking them off. So I usually take the backside of a butter knife and just pick them all off. It's really gross, but it does take care of it quicker. So that's kind of a quick breakdown on the most common pests we experience at the plant shop. But I'm not the most expert on taking care of them. This is just what I've done my research on, and that has worked. Oh, fungus gnats, we forgot about this one. This is definitely the most common pest issue that we deal with. So fungus gnats look like fruit flies. They are not super harmful to your plant, but they will drive you just wild trying to get rid of them. They lay their larvae in the wet soil. So if you're an overwaterer, I can guarantee that you've probably experienced fungus gnats before. They land in your cup of water. They try to fly up your nose. They're terrible. Sticky traps has been my #1 way of dealing with them. It's like that sticky fly paper. I get some that's long and skinny. You can stick it down in your soil, in your plant, and then I also hang it up in the air near that plant, and that'll usually get all of the adult flying bugs. And then if they've laid larvae in the soil, you may see them emerge just on the tops of that soil. And so I usually go ahead and just repot the plant that I see them coming from, and that usually takes care of them pretty fast. This is where that decorative soil topper that I was talking about earlier can come in handy. So turfus, which is that fine limestone rock, I put that on top of every single one of my plants I grow at home, and it seems to really help, I think, with the fungus gnat issue, because I think they can't bury down in there as much to lay their larvae, and so it seems to have really helped me having something on top of the soil of all my plants at home. Again, because I do tend to be a little bit of an overwaterer, and my soil might be a little overly moist. That's what fungus gnats like. So I think that using that decorative topper can really help getting those sticky traps or repotting the plant if you have a really bad infestation coming from one pot and you can isolate it. So these are the pandemic favorites that I want to hit on. I'm going to come out of the viewing my screen view and just show these to you because I have them at home. So let's talk about first alocasias. Alocasias have been really popular lately. They're elephant ears, but they're an indoor variety, and so they tend to stay a little bit smaller. This is Allocation Maharani. Look at that beautiful foliage. I love this plant. And then the back sides of the leaves are just beautiful too. These have been really popular lately, I think because they have a more rigid foliage and they just look really interesting. People have really taken a liking to them. They tend to not be a super complicated plant to keep. They like to be a little bit on the regular watered but not overwatered side. So we water these about once a week at my house. They are not particularly needy, although you can get a little bit of leaf burn in the wintertime because this has probably gotten too dry or too cold. I keep it near a south-facing window. And so something has happened to make that unhappy, but I'm not worried about it. I don't need my plant to look perfect. I just want to know that it's happy and healthy, and it is. It just has a little bit of an unhappy edge right there. So this is Allocation Maharani. The weirdest thing that's been popular lately, have you guys heard of moss balls? They're super trendy right now. So I think it might be kind of hard to see, but here you go. So this is called a Marimo moss ball. It is a ball of algae, and it just lives in water. It's an aquatic plant, and people love these things. They're really trendy. They buy them and give them names. They might even buy them a little decoration for the outsides of their pots. So they grow, a true Marimo moss ball grows in the lakes of Japan and in Europe. These are home cultivated moss balls, so somebody's growing these in their basement. They are a ball of algae. Once a week you pull it out of the pot, you change the water, I rinse it out like a sponge, and that's it. They're soft, they don't smell great, and they like cool conditions, so they don't like a lot of bright light. They're a great desktop plant. So that's a moss ball. Earlier we talked about Calatheas, those plants that need distilled water. Here is one of mine. This is Calathea Orbifulia. This plant has beautiful foliage, and man, she is a diva. So I used tap water on her once when I was experimenting, and let's see if you can see that. Do you guys see that leaf burn that happened there? That happened really bad to a lot of the leaves, and I had to cut a lot of the leaves off because they were just really mad. But there's some new growth coming in, so I know she's happy. They like a lot of humidity. They grow on the bottom of the rainforest floor, so they like very dappled light. They like that distilled or purified water or rainwater if you collect rainwater. They do not like the Lawrence tap water, I can tell you that. I grow this one in my bathroom right next to my shower, and it loves it. And then the last one we'll talk about, actually two more. Peperomias have been really popular. They're a pet-safe plant, so I think they've been trendy because they're one of the few plants that won't make your pet sick if they eat it. This peperomia, it's called peppermill, has this really interesting green variegated foliage, and it grows in an upright position, so it's a nice compact plant. Pet safe, watered about once a week. It doesn't need a ton of bright light, so I grow these in a more of a medium light situation, and they tend to be fine. So that's peperomia. It's a big family of plants. There's a lot of them. There's vining ones, there's upright ones, there's bushy ones, so that's those guys. And then one more, Hoyas. Hoyas are really having a trend right now. Hoyas are cool because they are a vining plant, and they grow, it usually is an epiphyte, meaning it grows off the edge of another host plant, usually a tree. So they're fairly low maintenance. They need quite a bit of bright light, and we water these about every 3 weeks at my house. They're not hard to grow at all. They tend to be a fairly forgiving plant. They're also pet safe, which makes them pretty popular. So that's a Hoya. This is a Princess Hoya. So I'm ready to do questions now, and we can jump into those and start firing away at people's questions.
Okay, excellent, excellent. We'll start at the top of the chat box, and then I'll open up if anybody wants to just verbally ask a question. So let's see, a lot of comments, good tip on the distilled water. But on that topic of distilled water, can reverse osmosis be used instead of distilled?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. Reverse osmosis, distilled, a really good filtered water, rainwater, those all count. Typically a household filter, like a filter in your fridge, is not enough to remove that chloramine or chloramide that we talked about earlier. So it usually needs to be more purified past that if it's a plant that really cares. But reverse osmosis is great.
Okay. Here's somebody with a tip about putting house plants in the bathtub while you're gone on vacation. So if you have any concerns about that, but also in this question is how often does a peace lily need watering?
Seems like, what did they say? Seems like
it yellowed leaves when watered once a month.
I gotcha. I wait until my peace lily looks a little bit droopy and then I water it. So I wait for it to tell me. I lose some leaves by doing that because the bottom ones will dry out, but I would personally rather err on the side of letting it be a little bit dry and let it get droopy and tell me that it's time for water than to overwater it. I have noticed peace lilies might be a little bit sensitive to the Lawrence tap water. I don't think that it's necessary for you to switch over to the purified water, but I have noticed some leaf burn on my peace lilies at home. But I suggest waiting until it tells you.
Okay. What is your opinion on plastic pots?
Plastic pots are fine. I have there's no reason in my mind why you shouldn't use plastic pots as long as there's a drainage hole. But a lot of times the plastic nursery pots that the plants come in are fine to keep them in as long as they haven't outgrown that size. But I think plastic pots are totally fine.
Okay. And then I think you touched on this with the garden soil or dirt versus bagged potting soil.
Yeah.
But do you have any other recommendations if you're buying a bagged potting soil?
Yeah.
You said you always had to amend them.
Yeah.
Are there some that come better prepared than others maybe?
Yeah, I think that there are typically more boutique plant stores or stores that specialize in houseplants already have amended soil ready for you to buy. Jungle House, for instance, we sell it in what we call apartment size bags. So we pre-mix up smaller bags of soil because a lot of our shoppers don't need the huge bags of soil. However, I really like the black gold soil at Cotton's. I think that's a great already amended soil if you need a really big bag, and they keep it inside where it's dry, which is what I'm most concerned about.
Okay. And a comment here about using lava rocks for orchids.
That's smart. I've never tried it. I'm going to try it.
Oh, okay, great. Diane says it's less rot that way.
That's really smart.
Maybe we have a problem. We can help Shauna out here. She says, I feel so guilty. I killed so many propagated plants. Change the water, keep them under grow lights, talk softly. But I've killed mini monsters, satin pothos. I put them in water and get a slimy bottom with no roots.
I would say maybe double check that you're getting a proper cutting with the right node that you need. I have seen people bring them in before and there's not actually a node on that cutting, and so it's just rotting because there's nothing there to produce roots. So you might just double check that you're getting an appropriate cut. You might also just try moving them over to soil. Just put them in soil and try keeping it moist and see if it works for you. Just because something works better for me doesn't mean necessarily that it's not going to work for you great. You might just try moving it to soil too.
Okay. How about your thoughts on sphagnum moss and propagation?
I do that. I cut up a very valuable plant, and I did not want to risk it being in water and perhaps rotting. And I didn't want to put it in soil because I personally am not good at that. So I put it straight into sphagnum moss. The sphagnum moss you have to pre-soak and keep it a little bit damp, and then put your cutting down in there and make sure it doesn't dry out all the way. And so far it's working pretty good, although I will say it's gone a little bit slower for me so far.
Okay. What about using Lecka in propagation?
Yeah, so Lecka is great. It's a hydroponic growing medium, so it's meant for that purpose. You just need to make sure you do your research on how to properly do it. You don't want to leave it in setting water, otherwise you're just doing a water propagation. You want to make sure you're flushing it with water, but Google can give you much better instruction on how to do that.
Great. And yes, a comment. And yes, just to let everybody know, this is being recorded, and the answers to questions will also be recorded, and we will post that on our website and announce it on Facebook when it's ready. So more questions. Any advice on growing herbs inside, especially the little Christmas tree rosemary plants?
So big disclaimer, I've never kept an herb alive inside very long. So don't take my advice very strongly, but here's my experience of what I do, especially those little rosemary Christmas trees. Bright light, consistent watering, don't let them dry out, has been the only way I've kept one of those alive, but I am not good at this, so I'm not going to tell you any more than that.
Great, that's good. Let's see. Excellent presentation. A lot of kudos, by the way, in here. So
thank you.
Do you sell the moisture meters?
We do, but you can also buy them plenty of places. I've seen them at Cotton's Hardware, and I've found them at, I think, Home Depot and Menards. I bought them online. You can get them a lot of different places. You just have to know where to look. At most big hardware stores, they're in like the potting soil area. At Jungle House, they're in our like accessories area.
Okay. And here's an interesting question. I haven't seen this. Is yellowing of the soil an indicator of anything that needs attention?
Yeah, that's usually a mold that's growing on top of the soil. It's like a sticky mold. In my opinion, it's not really a big deal. I just usually scrape it off and replace it with fresh new potting soil. But that's usually a mold that's growing. That typically comes from not enough air circulation.
Okay. And then linking to the question, I think, about herbs, but do they sell, are there starter or small indoor growing setups? You know, there's something.
I've seen ones before with herbs that there's like little trays and you plug your seeds in and grow them that way. If you're thinking more of an indoor growing setup with like a light and a heat mat and stuff like that, I have personally just purchased that all like a la carte off the internet. I'm not sure if Cotton's Hardware has heat mats or not. They probably do in the spring. But if you're going to do things like herbs or little propagations, I do suggest a heat mat, which is like a seed starting mat, and a grow light 6 to 12 inches away. Because if you're starting those little seedlings inside, typically our windowsills and places that are bright are too cold for them.
Okay. Let's see. I have red wigglers and use the worm compost in my medium, but I'm curious about any opinions on using worm compost tea. I
haven't done this personally at all, but I do use mealworm frass as a fertilizer, and I love it. I've never done the compost tea, but I do know people that do that and love it and think it's great. I just have never done it. I think any of that real organic material, though, like worm castings, mealworm frass, stuff like that, is an awesome fertilizer because it's gentle, and so you're not going to risk as much burn if you accidentally use too much and things like that. So I love using that kind of stuff. I just don't have any experience doing the compost tea.
Okay. And what type of grow light is best?
It's all personal opinion. I personally cannot stand in my house the purple grow lights. It just messes with my eyes. So I do a white grow light made by Sunblaster, and I like it better because it just looks more natural in the house. It still has the full spectrum, but it just isn't a purple physical bulb. They're usually a little bit more expensive for the white light, but that Sunblaster brand, I really like those.
Okay. And a question here about which house plants live the longest. Jean has a peperomia that's over 30 years old.
That's awesome. The ones I've heard most commonly that are the oldest are Christmas cactus. Somebody brought in a 4th generation Christmas cactus to be repotted, and I was terrified. It's like, please don't make me do this. But all plants can live a very long time indoors given the correct conditions. There's a lot of cactus that are pretty old that people bring in to be repotted. They were their dads or their grandpas, and they're all corky and cool by the time they're that old. But Christmas cactus, I hear a lot of being old.
Okay. Another question about grow lights. Let's see. And we're getting on to an hour and 15 minutes. Are you okay to stay on, Rachel? Yeah,
if everybody else is, I'm still good.
Great. If a plant is under grow lights, what type of lighting would you consider? Bright, direct, or indirect? Also, any opinion on full spectrum white over the red-blue mix?
Yeah, okay, so if a plant's under grow lights, it's usually a bright indirect situation, too direct if it's really close. You just want to monitor that plant for burn. So a burn on a plant looks like what you think it looks like. It's kind of crispy and black. And so then you know you need to pull that light back a little bit. What we talked about just a minute ago, the full spectrum white is just an aesthetic opinion over the blue-red bulbs. They still all have the same lighting. It's just what it looks like in your house and visually to your eyes. I prefer the white. I just think it's easier to look at, but there's nothing wrong with the purple or blue ones if they don't bother you.
Okay. A question about aloe plant. My aloe plant isn't growing. It had a brown spot mid-leaf, so I plucked it off. I only water it when it's dry. Is that my problem?
So the way that I usually answer questions like this is that I need a lot more information to actually help usually. But this is my thinking on that. How long have I had it? How long has it been in this pot? How long has it been in my house? If it's been in that pot longer than a year or 2 years, it might be time for fresh soil. If you're only watering it when it's dry, that's how I would suggest you water aloe. So I don't think that's necessarily wrong. And then how much light do you have it in? If it's not in a very bright place, it's probably not going to grow because aloes are a desert plant. They need more sunlight, although they don't like direct, but they like it bright. So I would just start by thinking through kind of your general troubleshooting things. How long has it been in this pot? Does it need fresh soil? How much light is it in? How long have I had it? If it's new to my house, then maybe it's not going to be growing very much for a little while. So start that way. If you need more help, you can always send me a message on social media and I can help that way too.
Okay. A question from an orchid grower. Just shifted the orchids to an inside-outside greenhouse set up in the basement, under grow light, 65 to 70% humidity. Someone mentioned to me that orchids need a temperature change to rebloom.
Yes, so this is true with orchids and Christmas cactus and things like that. I don't exactly have the science down verbatim, but I know they like a temperature change to help trigger that rebloom. That's usually a trigger in the seasons to them. So I would do a quick Google search on what the temperature change needs to be. Christmas cactus, for instance, if you want it to bloom at a very particular time, you usually have to put it in some place that isn't getting a lot of bright light for a little while to trigger that the seasons have changed. It's time for a bloom. So I would just do a search with somebody else that knows a little bit more than me on that and see what you can find out. But I do know that's true. Okay.
Now you talked about the worm tea, but this question also concerns mosquito bits.
Yeah. So mosquito bits, I have not had success with that, with treating fungus gnats, but I've heard a lot of people that do. So there are these little granulars of, I'm not sure what they're made of exactly, but they're supposed to keep mosquitoes at bay and like your bird baths and things like that. Houseplant people are putting them on top of their soil now to try to keep those fungus gnats at bay. I've had people tell me it works. I personally haven't had that experience. I have better luck with the turfus, but I think you should try it and see if it works for you, especially if you have fungus snaps, because that's horrible to deal with.
Okay, and I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this right. Question about Dracana marginata always having brown tips.
Yep.
Why is that, or is it just okay?
So usually I say it Dracena, but I've had people say it Dracana to me. Whatever's good with me. Usually brown tips are a sign of a couple things. It could be dry air. It could also be that plant went a little bit too long without water and it started sucking moisture from those outer edges into the leaf. I usually just cut them off and I think it's not that big of a deal. But if it bothers you, you might consider the dry air or the time of length spent between waterings.
Okay. Why would plants under heating vents struggle? Is it just moisture?
It's a moisture issue. Some plants seem to be really mad by the fluctuation in temperatures. Fiddly figs, I have nothing nice to say. Sorry to people that like fiddly figs. They always brown when the seasons change because of the heat vents, because of the AC, because of the moisture change. And I'm just 100% over them. But yes, it seems like it's usually a moisture issue or the air physically flowing over the leaves. So it seems like you might want to move it back from that heat vent or AC vent.
Yeah, and actually the very next question talked about the fiddly fig. Should they remove the old dry browning on the fiddly figs? Yeah,
so I would say it depends on what percentage of the leaf is brown. If it's just an edge, that plant is probably still, that leaf is still being helpful for photosynthesizing, so I'd probably just leave it. But if it's starting to get into the entire leaf, you might just go ahead and snip it. it's a difference of opinion. Some people really cannot handle it when their plant doesn't look perfect and beautiful, and so they just cut it off, and I don't think that's wrong. I personally just leave it until it's not serving the plant anymore, and then I take it off. But fiddly figs and me are not friends. I can't grow it. My mom has like 13 of them, and she's great at it, but she is careful, and I'm more of a like, take a look around the room, what's droopy, it gets water kind of person.
Okay. Do you, whoops, my question moved here. Do you flush the soil when you bring plants indoors or replace it entirely, specifically to prevent bringing in visitors?
Yes, I debated on talking about that today, but I decided to skip it for time constraints. But yes, anytime a plant is living outside and then comes inside, I suggest flushing the soil and spraying down the plant with a strong stream of water to get any clingers off there. I don't mind bringing in a few spiders, but sometimes I brought in like really bad ant infestations and stuff. So if you flush that soil, that can really help get rid of them and rinse the plant down. But yes, I suggest doing that. Some people don't. I've had a lot of people tell me they don't, and they're fine. And that's cool if that works for you. I've brought in ants, and it was really gross to deal with, so I prefer to just rinse it down.
Yeah. There is some advice, by the way, in the chat for people about the orchid blooming.
Awesome. Great.
And here's a question, probably a very common one. Do you ever just cut the brown tip off the leaves?
I do all the time. And here's the deal about running a plant store versus having plants in my house. At the plant store, if somebody sees a brown tip, they think the plant's sick. And so I have to keep those plants looking pristine and beautiful because people equate any sort of imperfection with a sick plant. At my house, nothing is perfect. You can't see this guy, but like he has really torn up holy leaves. He's old. He's been around for a while. It doesn't bother me, and it's fine. It's still serving the plant for photosynthesizing, and it's fine. But if something is really bothering you and you just can't stand it, I don't think there's any reason to not cut it off.
Okay. And a question, my Petra has had to be taken from my office to my house. I continue to water weekly, but I've noticed leaves dropping since it came home. I don't know why it's not happening.
I would ask you how long that's been, and then consider that change for the plant. So plants they can be a bit sensitive and finicky when they go through any kind of change, especially depending on the plant. I'm not super familiar with a Petra, but it could just be that the transition is being rough on it. The usual advice I tell people is if it's not like 40 to 50% of the plant that's losing foliage, just let it do its thing and kind of acclimate. If the light has changed tremendously, the plant usually can't, if you've gone to lower light, for instance, the plant usually can't sustain all of that foliage anymore because it's not getting the same amount of light that got back at your office. So it might need to lose a few leaves just to, stay happy and sustain itself. But if it's under half of the plant, I probably wouldn't worry about it. Give it time, stay calm, don't freak out, give it a chance. And then, if that continues, maybe consider what else is going on.
Okay, great. That is the end of our chat box questions.
Awesome.
Would any, no, we got one more coming up here. I bought oh dear.
Yeah.
I lost the question now. I bought a Tula that got really cold during shipping, and it lost almost all of its leaves. Yeah.
I don't suggest, I see that they followed up with will it come back. I don't suggest having plants shipped in the mail this time of year without a heat pack. It just is really traumatic, and more often than not, you'll get a plant that doesn't have any foliage left on it by the time it comes to you. But since you've already done that, I would just give it a lot of TLC. If the node part is still green and living, I would try to propagate that node, water, soil, sphagnum, moss, whatever you prefer, and give it a chance to grow some of that foliage back. If the node and the stem is mushy and has gotten frozen, then it likely will not come back. But it won't hurt to try. So you might as well give it a try. I've had a couple plants shipped legally with paperwork imported from out of country, and both times they've died, and so I personally probably will never try that again. It took them over a month to get here, but it was a plant I really wanted to try. So I saw they followed up with, it's a full pot, so it's got a lot of roots. I would probably, if it were me, I would take it apart, separate out each stem, and try to propagate it in a few different ways so you have the best chance at one of them surviving. I would not keep them all in a pot of soil, if there's not much foliage left, it's just going to rot. So I'd pull it out, try your propagation method, maybe try it a few different ways.
Okay, great. Well, let me open it up now. If anybody wants to ask a quick question verbally, since we finished the chat box, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one. People usually get pretty shy when I open it up.
Yeah, that's all good. If anybody has any further questions and they specifically want to ask me, they can definitely, I'll put my social media username and my email over here, and they can always ask me too.
Okay, do we have any questions?
I'm thinking. I do.
Okay.
This is Rebecca. I actually haven't experienced it. I've just, a dear friend of mine has been doing a lot with monsteras, and I'm trying to remember what the other plant she said had it. But anyway, something called Mosaic Virus. Have you ever experienced that?
Yes, I actually asked about this on my one of my Master Gardeners talk this year. I'm fairly confident I have a plant that has Mosaic Virus, and basically the biggest issue and kind of concern that you run into is that houseplant to houseplant, it can spread by the use of dirty tools. And also, I believe they might have said spores. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's what the person said. So my opinion would be to destroy the plant and get rid of it. But if it's something that you want to try to save, I would just do your due diligence and research on how to keep that from spreading plant to plant. But the one that I had that I thought had it, I asked in this lecture about it, and I destroyed it afterwards. So I got rid of it. So
that's also what she and I talked about. Again, I don't think mine has it.
Yeah.
She had one that had it, and she was thinking it came in close to like tomatoes related. And so everything we read about it, yes, it didn't sound lovely to have into a house. So yeah. Okay.
It's a much more bigger concern outside in agricultural purposes because it can spread from crops to crops. Whereas inside, it's a little more contained, although you don't really want your plants to have it. It can make some weird deformities. I will say, and I'm not saying this is your case at all, but I will say now that people are becoming aware of things like Mosaic Virus because it's on social media, everybody thinks their plant has Mosaic Virus now. I've had like 7 people come in the past 2 weeks like, it's got Mosaic Virus, and I really don't think it actually does. But I'm not saying that's the case here, but I would just say do due diligence research on like what's going on with my plant. Is it going to infest other plants and things like that? So but I do unfortunately think because of social media now, people know what it is and they want to think all their plants have it. So
gotcha. All right. Well, that's fair. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I would probably get rid of it if it was me.
Well, from the pictures on her, it was the Swiss cheese. It definitely was. I mean, there was no questions there. So
yes, that is one of the plants, the Monstera ansonii I've seen a big infestation of those in South Florida. I have a friend that lives down there, and they're sending me pictures at some of the wholesale greenhouses, and it's pretty bad. So it would not shock me if it's on that plant at all. I would get rid of it.
Works for me.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I guess we're done. A lot of thank yous and kudos in the chat box for all the great information.
Awesome.
I'm always a little intimidated by the houseplant thing. I've finally managed to keep mine alive.
Yeah.
Within a year, just because of changing watering technique. That's all I had to do. I haven't done any of the other fancy things that things that you've suggested, Rachel, but I'll up my game now. So.
Yeah. No, I think that is it. I think 90% of the time when somebody kills their houseplant, it's because they overwatered it. And like, we just want to care for them. We want to love them and show them that we care for them. And they just, a lot of times don't need that. And they just want to kind of be left alone. So I think you're in good company. That's when I first got into plants. I'll spill the beans now. I have about 250 houseplants. But when I first got into plants, I killed every single one of them. But that's how I learned. I learned what I did wrong, and then I rebought it, and now I can keep it alive. So yeah.
250. Wow.
Yeah, at the most I had 500. It was before we opened Jungle House, and it's embarrassing. I had like a major hoarding problem, but when we opened Jungle House, I just sold them, so it worked out.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel.
so much.
It was
Kristen,
fabulous.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's wonderful. And yes, I will put this recording up online and announce it on Facebook so you can go back and look at all this great information.
Awesome.
So,
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
And I'm glad you're joining being Master Gardeners in this.
Me too.
series.
I'm so excited about it. I'm really excited to have a plant passion that isn't just houseplants that I can learn and grow and be interested in. And I feel like really up my game overall as a gardener.
yes, and we will certainly welcome your knowledge. So,
Yeah, thank you.
all right. Okay, everybody, have a great day. Enjoy this beautiful weather.
Yeah, enjoy the beautiful weather. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.